Let me be the first to say thank you for joining us for our first community conversation. I am Sue Bernier, the Chief Philanthropy and Marketing Officer at Island Institute, where I've worked for just 2 years. I have learned how to say Chebeague, I hope, correctly. And thank you for this island being our first island to hold up its hand to have a community conversation to talk about the challenges and issues for your community. First, before I do anything else, I wanted to offer special thanks to Island Institute trustee Carol White and former trustee Lila Bisharop, who have helped us to organize tonight's event. Your leadership and insights have helped us greatly. They've helped all of us stay on course. And so thank you very much for your help. I would also like to thank my colleagues that you'll meet soon, but also the wonderful fellows and other community members who've offered questions beforehand. Thank you so much for planning or helping us form the conversation that we're having tonight. Tonight's webinar is going to be recorded. So we are being recorded, but you will all be on mute. The reason for recording is to share today's presentation with you and other Chebeague residents who were unable to join us today. You will be on silent mode, but you have 2 options to communicate with us. If you have a question for us in this hour, and you can start anytime, please click on the Q&A button. That Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen is how you get your question into the queue. We'll also try to answer as many of your questions as time allows, but please know that we'll follow up via email. We did get some questions ahead of time in the registration pages. So we're going to try to do our best to answer all of them, but please know that some of those questions will get forwarded to the right program officer or the right person within Island Institute to follow up with you in the coming days. We will not be using the chat button for questions today, but please chat away with each other and say hello to folks. Or if you have a technical issue, we do have someone reading that chat room or that chat script, making sure that no one's having technical difficulties. Please remember to use that Q&A anytime during this conversation. We'll be looking at those, reading those regularly, and encourage you to start now if you have a question. Please note that everyone who pre-registered will receive a recording of today's presentation, other helpful links, other helpful information from our panelists who are already putting together information for you. Island Institute is in a very, very interesting, wonderful place. We're going to take just a few minutes to share our new strategic priorities for how we work in partnership with coastal and island communities, and more importantly, how we work with your island and community. We were founded in 1983, and we're a community development nonprofit organization based in Rockland. We have more than 50 full-time staff and more than 3,000 members. We serve Maine's islands and coastal communities and pay special attention to those 15 remaining unbridged islands. I've heard many people say within Island Institute that those 15 unbridged islands are our North Star, if that gives you any idea of the importance of those islands to our work. Along with strong and committed a network of partners and supporters, we're hard at work addressing some of the toughest challenges facing Maine's coast and Maine's communities. This is not an inclusive list of every challenge. You might look at this list and think, what about X, Y, and Z? That's a really great way to think about asking a question in our Q&A box. These are just some of today's challenges we recognize that are urgent threats to the coastal communities we love and where we live. These are interconnected issues, which we'll talk about a little bit more today. There might be other challenges, and we'd like to hear about them tonight, especially as they relate to your specific community on Chebeague. I also would like to share with you that although there are many, many challenges, the Island Institute cannot possibly take care of be all things to all people, right? So part of our new strategic priorities and our new strategic framework is to focus our work and really prioritize where we, Island Institute, are positioned to make a difference, where we can have the biggest impact. At the same time, we're committed to connecting people and resources where we are not as well positioned to lean in. Again, we focus on the islands, the coast, and our marine-based economy. We put people first. Without the human capacity to address these challenges, we cannot be resilient to the next step of challenges ahead. Now, we understand that these challenges, and there are challenges, technical issues, there are recurring issues that, again, from one island to another community and up and down the coast and throughout Maine, there are statewide issues, but we are not a broadband organization, although we've become known as one, or a clean energy organization. We are instead an organization focused on building and mobilizing people. We begin and end with people and leadership along our coast to do hard things and have those tough conversations to navigate change. We see these challenges for our coast as a set of interconnected issues. So we look very purposefully for those connections between people and places, as well as between economic, climate, and social issues. By doing so and looking for that connectivity and where those points of, in a Venn diagram where things cross over, we are able to unlock more opportunities to go farther and faster. And we also think that that's a good way to share those solutions from Chebeague to another island, back to the coast, and even across the country and globally. How we're focusing. We're talking, and again, I said we begin with people. Our response to all of these challenges is empowering and mobilizing leaders. I invite you to visit our website. We've just launched a new leadership model or framework that has helped focus some of our internal organizational work, and we're now turning that model or framework to pilots within community. I can't promise you that we're going to show up tomorrow with wonderful facilitated leadership conferences, but we're getting there. One of the best examples of our work in leadership is the continued success of our fellows program. This photo here is taken, I think, just a couple of months ago. You might even see your Chebeague fellow Kieran there. She has, along with other fellows, been helping communities with all sorts of programs. Chebeague is also home to 2 former fellows who decided to settle on the island and make Chebeague their permanent home. That is an example of how our fellows program not only gives the human resources needed, but continues to help with the population, bringing young people and young families who settle on these islands to Maine. The other area of focus for us is climate solutions. Now, we make place-based investments through our Tom Glenn Community Impact Fund to benefit community, and also make those investments in projects and people that we can transfer or scale to accelerate action. What do I mean by that? We've recently invested with one young gentleman in Yarmouth who's bought one of the first electric outboard motors. What he is learning about that process, what he is teaching others, and how we can scale electric outboard motors up and down the coast of Maine as a climate solution begins with one investment in one person, and whether or not it makes huge impact over time is yet to be seen on that particular project, but we're very hopeful that these investments and in people and places will then translate into larger climate action up and down the coast. Tonight, you'll hear from one of our sea level rise team members who will share stories from another island that illustrates other work within climate action. It's not just electrification of the marine economy, and it is not just sea level rise. There are a lot of climate pilots within Island Institute that are turning into climate action in the state. The third, although not least or last important strategic initiative for us is working within a resilient economy. We don't necessarily take on the entire economy. There are so many issues for a sustainable and resilient Maine economy. Where we are focusing our work is, again, targeted investments to increase the ability of our coastal economy to adapt. We are now an interconnected and global market for our sustainable, wonderful seafood. And we have many, many issues that the rest of the country is facing that we can help solve here on the coast of Maine, and then other issues where Island Institute is just not the best suited organization to do so. We focus on the blue economy, the creative economy, the climate response trades, the digital economy, as well as other businesses and services that play a critical role in driving the coastal economy as a whole. Chebeague has its own stories of people looking to grow a business, diversify their income, or learning a new trade with help from Island Institute and that Tom Glenn Community Impact Fund. And I hope we hear from some of you tonight, especially if you have a direct experience with one of those opportunities through the Glenn Fund. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and start to warn my co-hosts and panelists that they are about to get called on. If they are ready to do so, I would love to introduce our panelists. And I just lost my script. Sorry, folks. We're going to first, and while I do this, please remember to start asking those questions while these folks introduce themselves. It's a great time to put your question in our Q&A. And to help you understand not only how we focused our work, but what the differences we seek to make in your community, we'll start with our new president, Tony Chatwin, very new President Tony Chatwin. Tony, what motivates you? What interests you most about working here at Island Institute and moving to Maine?
Well, thanks, Sue. And I'd like to thank Carol White and Lila Bisharov for inviting us here, and to the community members on Chebeague for taking time to have this conversation with us. I'm delighted to be here and to have joined the team at Island Institute. I really believe in its mission, and I actually can relate to the challenges that island communities face. I lived on St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. I know that's a much bigger island, but nevertheless, it's an island. And I also have spent a lot of time at sea. In fact, I'm an oceanographer by training, and have dedicated my career to improving the stewardship of coastal and marine resources for the benefit of communities that depend on them. One of my proudest professional achievements was creating a fisheries innovation fund that was what helped fishing communities around the country implement their solutions to sustainability and how to adapt to a changing environment. And so one of the things I'm excited about Island Institute is that's what the Island Institute does, helps communities adapt to a changing environment. So I'm looking forward to doing more of that. And I'm keen to learn from you today. And so please do share what are the most important issues that you want us to know about, or want me to know about. My colleagues probably know a lot more about it already, but I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce our marine scientist, Susie Arnold, Dr. Susie Arnold. Susie, you can tell them a little bit more about yourself. Can you share, though, as you do so, an example of another island community working on the issue of sea level rise?
Yeah, thank you, Sue. And thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. As Sue mentioned, my name is Susie Arnold, and I'm a marine scientist at the Island Institute. I've been here for about 9.5 years now, and I work predominantly on climate impacts on fisheries and the communities that depend on those fisheries. So tonight I've been asked to talk a little bit about sea level rise, and I had the opportunity to visit Chebeague a couple of weeks ago with some members of the select board and the planning board, as well as one of my colleagues, Abby here at the Island Institute, who's a new sea level rise team member. We're very excited to have on board, as well as Pete Slavinsky and his intern of the Maine Geological Survey. And we were out surveying how sea level rise is beginning to impact beaches and bluffs. So I'll touch on a little bit more about that later, but just for a couple points of context, I wanted to mention, I was a member of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council, and one of the things that we recommended to the Climate Council that was then incorporated into Maine's Climate Action Plan, Maine Won't Wait, was some recommendations around planning for sea level rise. And those recommendations were taken to heart by the legislature and the governor, and they have now been made into law. And essentially what those what that planning guidance is that state agencies must incorporate considerations of 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 4 feet by 2100 into the administration of their laws and regulations. And this is absolutely daunting. It is, I recognize that 1.5 feet in 30 years is actually not the extreme scenario. So if I mentioned the extreme scenario, it's even more daunting. Or not even the extreme, the high scenario of 3 feet by 2050 and 9 feet by 2100, it's even more daunting. So it really does depend on what type of infrastructure you're planning for and the lifespan of that infrastructure and whether that infrastructure can get wet, how you would choose what planning scenario to use. So I've recognized that these are daunting numbers, but I wanted to point out something that is somewhat of a positive note in looking across the Maine Islands and just assessing vulnerabilities from one of my favorite tools to point folks to, which is the Maine Geological Survey's map viewer. It's readily available, very easy to use for non-scientists. Just Google Maine Geological Survey sea level rise viewer, and it will pop up. You can type in your address and you can take a look at flooding under various sea level rise scenarios. So if you take a look at that, and if you listen and you to community members and recognize where you might be having nuisance flooding already, it turns out that Chebeague might be a little bit better off than some of the other islands in Maine. I have heard concerns around the Stone Pier or Wharf. I've also heard concerns about Indian Point. So for sure, you certainly have your areas that are going to be impacted, but as compared to some other islands, you have relatively little public infrastructure that's going to be impacted immediately, which is a good thing, and it gives you time to plan. So I just wanted to give you that background context. And one point that I want to stress before I move on to an example coming from another island is that starting the conversation about planning early will put your community in a much better spot in terms of receiving federal dollars to actually implement some of these adaptation strategies, which, as you well know, are quite costly. So for example, there's some federal funding available through FEMA programs like the Building Resilient Infrastructure that has some pre-assessment dollars available for engineering surveys. There's also money available for shovel-ready projects. And then there's some other FEMA money, pre-disaster funds for marine infrastructure improvements. So having your ducks in a row puts you in a better position to receive some of those funds, which are going to be very much needed as many communities are tackling these issues around coastal flooding. So I wanted to share with you just a few points from the process that Vinyl Haven has been through. And some of you may have seen the recent documentary that Island Institute produced in partnership with some documentary filmmakers that highlights really the leadership of Vinyl Haven in terms of tackling their pretty significant issues around sea level rise. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's worth checking out. So for those of you who haven't been to Vinyl Haven, I know we have one staff member from Vinyl Haven on the call, but they call their downtown the down street, and it's a very big downtown for a small island, and unfortunately it's very vulnerable to flooding. So they've had their grocery store flooded in the past. Their parking lot is very susceptible. So back in 2015, flooding came up at a select board meeting, and they actually, with the partnership of their town manager, engaged the middle school science teacher who was looking into climate impacts on the island with their students. The students actually created a video highlighting the problems and some potential solutions that they could think of. They also built a gingerbread village and placed watermarks where they envisioned where there would be future problems. And they presented this to the select board. After that, maybe a couple presentations, the select board actually recommended that a sea level rise committee of 7 volunteer members was created. So that happened. Really to ensure that sea level rise is taken into account when they're doing their capital upgrades in downtown. In conjunction with the sea level rise planning, they also have a downtown revitalization project committee. Their Main Street needs sidewalks. They need some other infrastructure improvements under the pavement. And so by doing both in conjunction with one another, they were really ensuring that sea level rise is considered in that downtown plan. So, for example, an early step that they took that I know Chebeague has also taken is to write and be awarded a coastal community grant. In the case of Vinyl Haven, they hired Ransom Engineering to conduct a study of Carver's Harbor, their downtown area. They also completed something called the Flood Resilient Checklist, which I can't recommend enough. It's a very practical framework to evaluate the vulnerability and prepare for flood hazards. It's generally, it happens over the course of a day. It's facilitated by an expert who has taken communities through this checklist. And it touches on pretty much every department within the municipal government. So emergency management, economic development, land use management, etc. So the designers of the flood resilience checklist were the Maine Coastal Program. And in their experience, they found that top-down regulation doesn't necessarily lead to resilient change, but at the same time, bottom-up efforts sometimes lack guidance and effectiveness. So the checklist is really designed to meet in the middle and provide some recommendations to build resilience, but it doesn't mandate solutions. It's very action-oriented. The last thing that I wanted to mention is I understand that Chebeague's Stone Pier or Wharf is vulnerable to flooding, and that it's flooded a few times a year. Well, Vinyl Haven is in a similar situation with their ferry terminal, where they're already experiencing times when the vehicle access becomes difficult or impossible. So the last thing I'll mention in terms of Vinyl Haven is that through a Maine Coastal Program application to NOAA, it's called a Project of Special Merit, their ferry terminal was one of about 9 pieces of Penobscot Bay working waterfront infrastructure that was assessed by an engineering company called Wood Environment. And so they have some preliminary engineering analysis of what it would take for their ferry terminal to be basically brought up to speed in terms of future flooding scenarios. So that could be, the study obviously isn't transferable, but potentially speaking with Vinyl Haven might help move Chebeague forward. So on that note, I wanted to mention that we as the Island Institute are helping to have a follow-up conversation on Chebeague, likely virtual, on October 13th. And this is a Zoom event that will be organized by Island Institute, the Maine Geological Survey, specifically Pete Slavinsky, who I mentioned at the beginning, and the Chebeague Planning Board. And essentially, it will be an opportunity for Pete to share the monitoring data that he has done to date on some of the natural ecosystems of Chebeague that are impacted, like dunes and bluffs, and share some of the potential mitigation and adaptation strategies, in this case, specific to green infrastructure and living shoreline pilots that are underway in Casco Bay. So this, we are hoping, and this is a new idea that we've just thought about over the last couple of weeks, is that this could be the beginning of a few months where we hold monthly or bi-monthly conversations on Chebeague, where we discuss topics that are relevant to the community. So in this case, sea level rise, there's plenty of fodder for more sea level rise conversation, but I think it would also be really interesting to have a conversation with some of the fisheries stakeholders on the island to discuss some of the more challenging issues that are facing the lobster fishery. So with that, we will be in touch with more information about these follow-up conversations, but I definitely wanted to plant the seed for the October 13th evening.
And we'll remind all of you, as well as other folks who were invited via email, about these follow-up events, the links that were being shared in chat, and other resources for you. So if you're trying to frantically write things down, do not fear. We're going to send an email, I hope as soon as tomorrow morning, to follow up with some of these resources and a reminder about October 13th. Kendra Jo, let's get around to another very important topic, especially for our remote communities and islands. Interest in broadband, high-speed internet, has been reinvigorated by federal dollars coming into Maine. Can you share a story from another island community that has recently moved the needle on access to high-speed internet?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Sue. Thanks, everyone, for having us and joining us tonight. So I'm Kendra Jo Grindle. Some of you on the call know me because of the broadband conversations, but for those that don't, I've been with the Island Institute in some kind of broadband capacity for almost 3 years. I'm the strategic lead of both our broadband teams and our sea level rise team. So I work pretty closely with Susie as well. And for some, those two don't seem to fit, but some of what Susie said, I also say about broadband. This is place-based infrastructure that needs community engagement and needs a lot of planning to be prepared for all of the federal funding that can come around with different administration changes, different priorities, and different opportunities of emergency in our country. So we've seen the tide shift on broadband over the last couple of years, but Maine has really been diving deeply into broadband. Our islands have been diving deeply into broadband since about 2015, 2016, alongside the Island Institute. Chebeague in some capacity has been working on broadband for even longer, given your history with the ways that you've taken your own lead on connectivity issues in your community. So looking at the federal funding that's coming in, really spurred by both an administration change, but also this highlighted need during the pandemic, that broadband is no longer can be looked at as a luxury. It has to be looked at as a piece of infrastructure. And Maine specifically, communities get a say. The more we see the state adapt and change around broadband, the more we see them willing to say the communities have a place at the table and they have the ability to have ownership. Our islands have definitely been leaders in this for years. So it's incredible to see the amount of work and planning and collaboration and learning that's happened across our 15 island communities, all dealing with similar connectivity issues, but not always similar approaches or models. So most recently, one community that has been working probably since about 2015, 2016, and just having conversations, having a committee that's planning and actively engaged around what it looks like to have a community-wide solution has been Swans Island. They recently went to a town vote for a couple of options. One was to do nothing. This is resident by resident. We don't see a need for a community-wide solution or a place for the community in the solution. We wish to do nothing. So the voters had the opportunity to vote on that. But they also had the opportunity to vote on two other things. One was a full municipally owned system with a non-incumbent provider, so a provider that's not already providing service in their community. The other was to move forward with an incumbent provider, someone who's already providing service for them. They chose to move forward a $1.8 million bond to work with their incumbent provider, TDS, to move forward a full fiber to the premise build and bring equitable internet access throughout the community. They have gone through phases of what they were wanting over the past couple of years, but this really set well for the community, both with the monthly tier rate costs, the speeds that were going to be allowed, and the position that they're in. So they don't necessarily look different connectivity wise, but over the last 6 months, the Connect Maine Authority has redefined what broadband means for the state. They took a step beyond what the federal government has said, which has always been that broadband and unserved speeds are 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. I can tell you that that is not great internet, as some of you might already know. But the Connect Maine Authority decided to, one, separate those two things and say that to be unserved, you have less than 50 over 10. So 50 megabits per second download and 10 up. Moving from that, broadband and the build to standard for the state is now 100 over 100. So 100 megabits per second download and 100 megabits per second upload. Having those numbers equal puts the state moving forward on specific technologies that are able to adapt and expand with the needs of a community and with the needs of a resident. So it has the ability to scale up over the next 10, 15, 20 years. With the 100 over 100 standard, it also allows the state to say any infrastructure that's being put in with state funding has to build to that measure. So that starts to get them specifically looking at different kinds of technology and narrowing in on the ones that are sustainable and are meant to be long-term solutions, not short-term bridge the gap solutions that we've seen in the past. So a lot of this state funding, federal funding that we're seeing coming in, it is spurring a lot of conversations. It is focusing communities. I hope that it starts focusing more communities because it does allow the opportunity to go a little chaotic, and there's just so much money. But it's still not everything that Maine needs. So it's still competitive money. The communities, like Susie kind of mentioned in Sea Level Rise, the communities that are planning, that are focused, that have community support and have identified what their path forward is, are going to be the communities that are ready to access this funding. Chebeague is in a good position to do so, had incredible amount of planning over the years, a revived committee, and it's inspiring to see. And with the standard changes at the state level with the Connect Maine Authority, you are in a good position because fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of your community is unserved with that definition change. So you are in a good position as a whole. There's still a lot of conversation that should happen to focus in on what the solution is moving forward. So I hope maybe we can get to some questions tonight and talk a little bit more. I know that there's been some activity happening in the past week around broadband. I do want to flag for those on the call, and I'll throw some information in the chat, that the Cumberland County as a whole is having a regional dialogue around broadband. This is supported by GPCOG, my acronyms, Greater Portland Council of Governments, and the Maine Broadband Coalition. So hopefully there'll be commissioners on the calls, representatives from all of the towns. And this is happening this upcoming Monday at 8 a.m. I know that's early for some and not for others, but I'll throw the link in the chat to register. It might just be good to hear what's going on in specifically your county around broadband and what they're talking about.
Thanks, Kendra Jo. This is a somewhat related question, so I'm going to stay with you for just a second. We did a lot of promotion, and certainly one of the ways to map underserved and served was broadband speed testing. Can I still do a broadband speed test? Is that still available?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yes, please.
It will be available for a while longer. It's already been open for a little over a year. The Maine Broadband Coalition in the state of Maine, the Connect Maine Authority has decided to keep that window of opportunity open. The state is still actively getting data through there. If your community has any desire to move forward on broadband, take a test, take it often. Reach out if you have questions around it to me or anyone else on our staff. We can talk you kind of through what it looks like, but there's great directions. I'll post the link for that also in the chat. But the more data points the state has, the better they are to show exactly what's happening in your community. We all know in broadband that state and federal maps for broadband are not accurate. They're provider driven. So it's advertised speeds, the best you could get, right? So the speed test, an upcoming challenge window to the maps, those are opportunities for the community to say, that might be my advertised speed, but this is what I actually experience in my home. And we know that speed tests aren't 100%, but it does go along with other data that's being put in place for the state to look at across the board and say, these are areas that are not getting service or just not having the quality of service that they should have. So I do encourage people to take the test, take it at various times. My internet right now seems good, but earlier today it wasn't, and I have a cable provider. So yeah, take it often, tell your friends to take it. I encourage everyone to. Thank you.
We will follow up with a link, folks. So if you didn't get one of those emails or any of our other requests to take those speed tests earlier this year, don't worry, we'll ask again and follow up in our email. Tony, I'm going to ask you to come back on mic and video. The first question from one of our participants is for you. When and how did you first become interested in oceanography?
That's a great question, and happy to talk about that because it actually has been a calling that I experienced very early in my life. I'm actually originally from Brazil. I grew up on a lake, and I spent my childhood exploring the lake, both inside and outside of it, and always hanging out with fishermen and asking them about what they caught and what interesting critters lived in the lake. So I was always looking to uncover the mysteries of the lake and the ocean, so much bigger mysteries to uncover. And so it actually is in my high school yearbook that I want to be a marine biologist. And I stuck with the plan, and I'm very happy having done so.
That's fantastic. I don't know of a whole lot of high school kids who actually stuck with the plan, or people who went to college and got a 4-year degree and are actually working in what they studied, right? It's true in both of cases for you.
That's right.
Susie, I'm going to ask you to come back on video, and Mike, if you would. What is the outlook for lobstering or the lobster industry in view of the vertical line controversy?
Wow, that is a big question, Sue. Thank you for asking and bringing that up. Well, I think that there's no doubt that the right whale regulations will lead to a transformation of the lobster fishery. It's been decades that Maine lobstermen have been dealing with regulations to protect right whales. And so I don't want to say that this is not new, but this recent rule, the final rule that was released on August 31st is different, much different. And the things that will come over the next 10 years are also much different, adding up to a 90% reduction in risk to the right whale, which means eliminating a whole lot of vertical lines. So that was the question about the vertical line controversy. And the issue is the amount of line that the fishery does have in the water in an area where there are thought to be right whales. And in some cases, there have been documented sightings of right whales. So I think, the first thing that we're dealing with right off the bat is this offshore closure that will go into effect on October 18th through the end of January. It's a 950 square mile closure. That's called that. Well, it's not a closure, it's a restricted area. You're allowed to use ropeless gear, which currently is not usable. So for the moment anyway, it's a closed area until ropeless can be made available to fishermen in a manner that is safe and useful. And in the springtime, there'll be some more restrictions around gear modifications that will be coming in on May 1st, some new marking rules. So there's a lot coming down the pike. And this is just kind of phase one. And so, yeah, there's no doubt that it's going to transform the fishery. I think that some things that the Island Institute would like to do is to have these hard conversations about what it means for the fishery. I'm also interested in trying to fill some of the data gaps that exist around where the right whales are. That's a concern I've heard from a lot of fishermen in terms of it's very difficult to tag a right whale for longer than 2 weeks. So it's very difficult to find right whales when they're not aggregating in the Gulf of Maine by flying overhead. So there's some strategies like listening stations that can be put out, but there's hardly any out there in the Gulf of Maine, which is really frustrating. So that is one area where I could see some more data over time being developed to have a better understanding of whether these regulations will in fact help the right whale in the long run. So I think we have plans to be having some more community conversations with fishermen to get an understanding. They have a lot coming at them in terms of offshore wind turbines and the right whale rules and increasing number of aquaculture leases going in. So there's lots of issues, and I think it gets into one of the other questions that was in the chat that I don't necessarily want to volunteer to take, but it does. I think it merits some kind of like future visioning and real big picture thinking about what we value along the coast. And maybe we can't have everything, but we should at least be identifying what we don't want to lose. And so I think that, when you think about all the issues facing the coast, there's lots of things to think about and, stand up for what we really want to protect.
So a follow-up question from another attendee. Are we better off than others and I'm not quite sure who others refers to, but you hopefully will. Are we better off than others because we use stringers? So we only have 2 vertical lines in the water.
Yeah, that's a tricky one to answer. You know, some of the gear modifications will be pertain to specific zones, and I think it depends more on where you're fishing those two traps. I mean, I think that you're pretty good in coastal areas, and if you're only fishing 2 offshore, well then sure, you're in a good position. But I'm not sure if that's what the person meant or not. If you could clarify, I'll take a stab at it.
Thanks. And I'm just going to remind everyone, put your questions in the Q&A box. I promise we're going to try to get to as many as we can. I also am going to promise that we won't necessarily have every answer tonight. I'm thinking of a couple of folks on our staff that would probably have great answers to stringers and all sorts of other jargon being used that I, for one, don't understand about the lobster industry. So I'm going to throw this one to Kendra Jo. First, a point of clarification and then a question. What is fiber to the premise?
Sure. So fiber is a technology that's an infrastructure that's used when connecting internet access. It is made of glass. So data is transmitted across fiber at the speed of light. So if you think of your typical copper or coax, which is cable, it goes like this, right? And so as the data goes across copper or coax, it slows over time and it slows over distance. It has the inability to transmit large packages of data. Fiber, it's like this, right? Straight shot. It doesn't decrease speed with age, so it doesn't degrade over time like we see with copper, typical phone lines, cable lines. It does not break as easily. It used to, but it's pretty condensely shelled. So it doesn't break as easily. We don't see a lot of fixes on fiber like we used to see. We don't see a lot of long-term maintenance. So fiber to the premise means that the entire way from a central office where all of the technology is held to across lines to every pole to your home, there is fiber. And the change that we've seen over the last maybe 5 years is that now providers are doing fiber all the way into your home. They used to stop at your door and then copper inside because they were afraid of putting glass inside someone's home and it breaking, and it's costly up front. So fiber to the premise or fiber to the home is just that, fiber all the way from the office to your home. Your cable provider, if there were cable providers on Chebeague, but Spectrum, Comcast, those in Maine, they do fiber to a node. So fiber all the way to maybe a pole on your road. And then the rest of the way into your home is copper-based infrastructure, coax or cable, or coax or copper. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit.
I knew you'd know. So what I'm going to stay with you for just a minute, a question from our audience. What are some of the viable options that might exist for broadband on Chebeague? And I know there's a question in the Q&A about providers or options for providers, but I know that we also talk at Island Institute about options or various financing models. So I don't know if this question was about financing or providers, but I'll let you answer however you like.
Yeah, I'll touch on a little bit of both. So every community has done something a little bit different. I say that often because every community is different. Their financial concerns are different. Their priorities around broadband are different. The needs of the community are different. Their current incumbents are different, which creates their connectivity landscape. So on Chebeague, you've consolidated and you have Axiom as kind of your land-based providers. You also have some wireless options as well. And you have satellite options, HughesNet, and maybe for a select few Starlink, if that's a possibility financially for them. So there are, kind of several options in the scope of things. The state, when it comes to state funding, we only look at land-based infrastructure as options. So not wireless, not satellite. That's how they consider served and unserved as well when it comes to technology. So my kind of first phase with communities is always that if you're looking for the cheapest option, talking to your incumbent is probably that. They already have infrastructure. They already have a lay of the land. They already have customers that they could switch over. If you're looking for the most efficient, most affordable, it's probably your incumbent, and some sort of model, municipal owned, or supporting in a private-public partnership, like some of our communities have done. Bremen is one. The kind of the model that Long Island was looking at was one. So somehow working with your incumbent, whether it's a cost share of the infrastructure or just strong community support to make sure that the subscriber rate is there, that take rate, so how many people are taking service, is there, because all of that equals profit. It makes the cost upfront equal out over however long they're looking for that return on investment. For a lot of providers, it's 5 years. For a lot of communities, it's 20. So I would say that, for Chebeague, Consolidated and Axiom are definitely two front runners for providing service. You're an island, and a small community at that, with its own technical difficulties for getting service to your community. The one thing that I would say is it's hard to entice non-incumbents to islands. We've seen it across most of our communities without a municipal ownership, because that municipality taking that capital burden off the provider up front makes it a bit more enticing for them to come out. It also, when the community takes on some of that cost burden, even if you're offsetting it with grants or private dollars, it also allows them to be assured that there's a reason why the community would want to switch from whatever service they have to this service, because they're paying back a debt with their subscription rate. So there are providers of interest. I know there was recently an RFP that was put out with some responses, and that's the process that communities go through. If providers don't want to respond or are not interested for whatever reason, they have too many projects, they could make profit elsewhere, the logistics of islands are just not something they're interested in. We have providers that definitely say that. Then you're kind of left with who's able to serve you and willing to serve you. So yeah, I'm always happy. Our team is always happy to foster some of those conversations. I know that both the previous committee and the current committee in the community have had several conversations with providers, or just listening and questioning conversations with providers throughout the state. But the front runners for us, at least in that area, would be GWI, Axiom, Consolidated, possibly Spectrum in that area. But their approach to community broadband is a bit different than the previous ones that I listed. So yeah, I would say that so far the committee and the town has gone down the right pathway of planning, discussing, and going to RFP to gain interest. If still the community isn't satisfied, then I think it's revisiting what the priorities and goals of a community are for internet access, and to what extent the community wants to be involved in a community-wide solution, and what they're looking for in a partner. So I'd say I saw some concerns come up in some of the question. I think it's your ability to have honest conversations with other islands, other communities who have worked with those providers as well. If you have concerns about their size, their longevity, the relationship they have long-term with communities, I would refer you honestly, not to the provider, but to the communities that they're working with.
It's really the essence of a community-driven process for both sea level rise and broadband, and well, just about all of our work. I am going to throw the next question to Susie. You said sea level rise is being reviewed as impact on infrastructure and whether it can stand water when it gets wet and get wet. What about the impact on aquifers? Does Chebeague or any sea level rise community or island have to consider the security of fresh water?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that fresh water is the biggest concern that the island of Monhegan has around sea level rise on their island. In this case, they're more concerned about the ocean overtopping a road and entering their aquifer from above, rather than what's, I think, more common in most areas, which is the saltwater intrusion up into drinking water wells. I will say I missed an opportunity to talk to Carol White about this just yesterday. I was going to ask her if Chebeague had drinking water concerns, and you guys are lucky enough to have a resident expert on that topic. So Carol would be able to give you better detail on drinking water studies that have been done on Monhegan. And also, I know there was an early study done on Vinyl Haven, but I can't spout off what Vinyl Haven learned from their studies, but I do know that remains Monhegan's biggest concern is impacts to their aquifer.
I was recently on Monhegan, and it was the very beginning of the summer, and we were already reserving water at the beginning of June. So very big concern, not only drought, but sea level rise and that infringement on that aquifer. Big concerns out on Monhegan. Tony, got a question for you. What is going to be your top priority as you take the reins of Island Institute?
Well, that's a great challenging question. Actually, maybe not so much. My biggest priority is to scale the impact of the Institute. The Institute does great work along many different lines. We're hearing about two of them, you know, sea level rise and broadband. And I'm interested, and the board of directors has told me they're interested in seeing us do even more of the great work that we're doing. And so scaling impact, I'd say, is the biggest, the most important priority for me.
That's no easy task for you or this organization.
It's not, but I got to say, there's a great team, and you're seeing several folks are seeing several members here, but there's a great team, and I really believe that we're up for the task.
I do too. Susie, is there anyone talking about technology to monitor whales and other marine mammals on the 5,000 plus fishing vessels, lobster boats? So in a sense, crowdfunding the location for right whales and other mammals?
I saw that question in the chat, and I've been thinking about it a little bit for the last couple of minutes. And I don't know that there is technology that's feasible to deploy on all of the lobster boats, but I will say that there is, in its infancy, however, proposed cooperative research coming from the University of Maine with some shoestring funding to get some more listening stations on lobster traps. Unfortunately, that's 7 listening stations. So it's not a huge, I mean, it would be one that would be going in the 950 square mile restricted area. And that area, in order for those listening stations to cover, almost all of it would need far more than one, probably like 6 or 7. There'll be one listening station going in around the area of interest for the offshore wind research array. So there's a huge number of gaps. I think what I love about that question is the idea of engaging fishermen and getting more monitoring. I think that is critical, and I would love to see the program that I've heard about coming out of UMaine and the Lobster Institute and DMR around getting more listening stations out deployed by lobster men and women on their traps, if that's most effective, or just having them as the research platforms to get those listening stations deployed in more areas of the Gulf of Maine.
Yeah, it's key that we involve the folks working on the water, right? I will also follow-up question that I heard from someone I met with just yesterday. It's not just right whales, right? We're concerned for humpback whales and other marine mammals. So even the headlines and the most urgent concern is right whales, we're really talking about listening stations and other work that could help track or find where they are as well as they are not for all marine mammals.
Yes, that's right. And I think that's a cool thing about the acoustic sensors is that they pick up the calls of all of the whales, which is good and on the one hand, and tricky on the other hand, is if you're really looking for the whereabouts of right whales, it can be tricky to decipher. I mean, there are algorithms that can differentiate between humpbacks and right whales to some extent, but in many cases, if it's confusing, it requires a human to actually confirm them, and sometimes they can't even be confirmed. So as far as looking for other marine mammals, I think that particular type of monitoring is more fruitful than putting a tag on an individual whale, because then you don't get any information about other marine mammals.
Thank you. You remind me of anyone with kids under the age of 20 is probably thinking of the movie Nemo and Dory doing her whale impersonation. So not Dory doing whale impersonations, much more algorithm based, correct? I think we've got time for one more question. I would love to hear from each of you if you can think about this, but I'm going to pick on Tony first. What do you see as the greatest opportunity or opportunities for the Island Institute with our new framework and our new leadership?
I think the greatest challenge that we all have is how much the world around us is changing. And I think that is where the greatest opportunity for us to help is. How do we adapt to this changing environment? The changes that are impacting sea level, sea chemistry, where whales are going, and how that's affecting human economic activity, the lobster fishery, and aquaculture, and others. And I think the new structure and strategic focus of the Institute has been developed to make the organization better able to address this huge challenge that we all have. And I think that is the biggest opportunity. Right now, we have the opportunity to make to help communities adapt to this changing environment, and I'm really excited about that.
Thank you, Kendra Jo. My ghostwriter just reframed the question a little easier for me. What excites you about your work looking into the future?
Oh man, I was so prepared for that question.
It was easier on you than I just was on Tony. Apologies, Tony.
I mean, what excites me, I mean, specifically about broadband first is, you know, we've kind of been calling these collateral benefits of a pandemic, if you can call anything a benefit of what this country and this world has been through over the last couple of years. But the pandemic, having to work from home, having schools shift to remote, having decades old barriers on telemedicine and healthcare lifted, and having everyone in some way, whether it's directly in their home or via a resource they need or a family member, be impacted by a difficulty of service. There are probably people on here right now that it's glitching, or you can't hear, or you've had, you know, you're glad your screen isn't on tonight. So right now, what I'm really excited about is the identification that broadband is infrastructure, and it should be treated as such. It's not, we're going to repeat it again, it's not a luxury, and it's not for those that have and not for those that have not. So this shift that we've seen in the conversation, the shift that we've seen in money, Peggy Schaefer at the Connect Maine Authority loves to say that in places where you don't have money, you get really good at planning. Maine has been really good at planning. We are planners, we're good. We need money. And so we're getting some money. Again, it doesn't cover the entire shortfall to close the gap of the unserved, of those who have service, but it's unaffordable. Those in urban areas who have really poor, old quality service. So I'm excited to see communities really rally together. Our island stepping forward again as leaders, mainland communities working together in ways that they haven't on other infrastructure projects, and looking to each other to understand what works, what doesn't, and how to move forward. So I'm excited over the next couple of years. There are things we don't know. There's a new connectivity authority. We aren't sure exactly how they're going to move forward. The $450 million in federal fundings they're poised to get. But they're learning from where Connect Maine Authority has left off. And the Island Institute, our communities have been a huge part in the the shift and focus shift from providers to communities in broadband. So I'm really excited to see where they take it. They have a lot more allowance to do more grants, loans, own their own infrastructure. So I'm excited to see that. And we work across so many things, which for some people is confusing, and for others, it's amazing. We get to see community leaders in all shapes and forms. And so I'm really excited to see how we can help prioritize and have harder conversations. And we work across a lot of infrastructure. These are not small price tags. These are multi-million-dollar projects, and helping community leaders shape the conversation to have priorities, understand what's needed now, but also look out for 40 years. What does generational solutions look like in our specifically island communities? So I'm excited for that across our work and what our strategic framework and leadership has been able to do to support it.
Thank you. Susie, quickly, it's 7:32. I apologize to our guests if you've got just one more minute. Susie, what excites you about your work looking into the future?
I am excited on a daily basis because of our networks of my colleagues at the Island Institute and by the community members that I get to work with. I think that combination makes our organization well suited to help communities take a holistic approach to mitigating and adapting to climate change. And one example of that is I never would, as a marine scientist at maybe an academic institution or a research organization, I never would have been able to link the importance of broadband infrastructure as a climate adaptation strategy. Like that's just would have been thinking so far out of the box, it never would have occurred to me. And so I love that I work at an organization that makes me think about those things, where at the same time I can also really get into the nitty-gritty about how kelp aquaculture is good for the planet. So it's like it's an exciting place to work, and I feel like just on a day-to-day basis working with the communities has been great. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I'm going to remind our attendees that if you've asked a question we didn't answer, we're going to forward those to the right person with the right information and get back to you, I promise. I also encourage you to contact us at any time with any questions. We will follow up this webinar with a recording and other resources. So again, if you missed that link in the chat box, don't worry. We're going to send all of that information to you. And as Susie already talked about, on the 13th, there's another conversation about sea level rise. And there's a series of ideas or concerns or questions that Susie, Carol, and others have been talking about. So this is the first of many conversations. We do want to continue to hear from you. We were hoping we were doing this in person so we could be better listeners and less of talkers, but welcome back to COVID. Thank you for attending. If you are not already an Island Institute member, I can't let you go without thinking or asking you to consider becoming an Island Institute member. We do not do any of this work without support from the community at large. And again, thank you to my panelists. Thank you to Carol and Lila, and a special hello to Sue Hale, who I think is also on the call. And thank you to all of you attendees for taking the time to be with us tonight. We will be in touch as soon as tomorrow morning. Thank you.